Jon Snow stood on the battlements of Winterfell long after the sky had turned an inky black, the last vestiges of twilight swallowed by an endless shroud of darkness. A biting wind tugged at his thick cloak, as if eager to remind him that winter had truly arrived. Overhead, the moon was pale and lonely, lending only a faint glow to the courtyard below. He could hear men in the distance, voices echoing in the still air as they patrolled along the walls. The smell of torches and the distant memory of warm fires drifted to his nose, but little about that comforted him. The real threat lay in the distance, a threat more real than any who roamed Castle Black or the roads to King's Landing. He could all but feel the tremors of the approaching dead beneath his feet. Jon rested both hands on the cold stone, his breath misting before him as he closed his eyes in contemplation. The memories of the night beyond the wall still weighed heavily on him, replaying in his mind every time he tried to chase them away. The Night King had come upon them swiftly. No matter how many times Jon tried to recast that memory, he could still see the swift crack of the White Walker's spear of ice, still feel the chill of that terrible presence. But there was something else that haunted him more than the countless whites in that horde. A monstrous silhouette, wings made of frost-blue membranes that shimmered in the pale moonlight. Viserion, or rather what was once Viserion turned abomination, raised from the dead by that very demon in human-like guise. Jon had witnessed the fall of Daenerys's beautiful creature in that frozen lake, had seen the dragon's body drag under the water, tail lashing in final protest. He had witnessed the bright golden eyes go dark. Even more horrifying was what had followed. Viserion's resurrection. The dragon's mighty form, pulled from the watery grave, reawakened as an instrument of the Night King's will. The memory made Jon's heart feel as if it had turned to lead in his chest. He opened his eyes again, surveying the silent ramparts. Torches flickered, reflecting in the eyes of those men and women who pledged to stand against the greatest threat the world had ever seen. He thought of Daenerys, of how she would soon ride regal, and how every ounce of his being willed her to be safe. And if there was a silent, secret hope that something might be done for Viserion as well, Jon tried to stifle it. The gods weren't often so merciful, or so it seemed. The courtyard below was a hive of quiet urgency. Rows of sharpened stakes angled outward like an angry sea urchin around Winterfell's perimeter. Wagons of dragonglass-laden weapons passed through the main gate, the black stone glinting with lethal promise. Archers tested their bowstrings under the watchful eyes of the captains, and the Unsullied drilled with impossible discipline despite the freezing cold. The men and women loyal to the Starks, his family, bustled as well, determined faces etched with the knowledge of the trial that lay ahead. Samwell Tarly stood near a stack of books and scrolls, consulting old manuscripts about the long night. Though a few novices and scribes from the Citadel had belittled him in the past, here he was a revered authority. So many times Jon had turned to Sam's counsel. Sam's presence down there, leafing through pages in the flicker of torchlight, lent Jon some comfort. If there was any obscure knowledge to be gleaned about how to defeat the White Walkers or about the nature of this resurrected ice dragon, Sam would find it. In a far corner, Davos Seaworth worked with a small group of engineers to reinforce crucial structures. Tyrion Lannister was just visible in the dim light, quietly assessing the preparations, no doubt calculating strategies with his keen mind. Grey Worm led groups of Unsullied in disciplined marches across the yard. Even Gendry the blacksmith was hammering away, forging last-minute weapons of dragoglass. Every soul in Winterfell found a purpose. But it was the hush of dread that hung in the air that spoke most loudly to Jon. Even the roar of the forges or the barked commands of the soldiers seemed subdued. There was a collective intake of breath, as if everyone was waiting for the unearthly wail of the undead to shatter the fragile quiet. He gazed toward the horizon. There was a sorrowful, haunting hush in the wind. He closed his eyes, feeling that intangible presence that told him the enemy was close. And somewhere amidst that monstrous legion was a once noble creature, a fallen dragon, its existence now twisted and unholy. Jon felt the pang of it like a physical blow, that sense of something so mighty perverted for the cause of darkness. A soft step behind him drew his attention. He turned to see Daenerys Targaryen, her face illuminated by the torchlight, silver-gold hair braided and pinned away from her face. Even in the cold wind she carried herself with a regal calm, yet her eyes revealed the same burden that Jon felt. She stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on his forearm. "They'll be here soon," she said. It wasn't really a question. He nodded, turning his gaze outward again. "Yes. Maybe by morning. Maybe sooner." She looked at the land beyond the walls as if she could see them coming. "Do you remember the last time we were all together in peace? It seems so far away." Jon held her hand in his for a moment. "Things seemed simpler then. But we've always known this day would come." She took a shivering breath, more from emotion than cold. "Viserion," she hesitated as if the name tasted bitter on her tongue. "He's out there." Jon bowed his head, letting out a slow exhale. "Aye. He is." They stood in silence for a moment, each lost in the knowledge of what must be faced. The living and that which was once living would clash. Daenerys tightened her grip on Jon's hand, seeking both comfort and resolve. Far below, a single horn blast echoed across the grounds, abrupt in the stillness. Then another. The watchers on the wall pointed frantically toward the horizon. A hush fell over the yard. Men and women alike froze, training sharpened senses at the darkness beyond. The enemy had been sighted. The two parted, Daenerys heading off to check on Rhaegal and Drogon, and Jon descending from the battlements to the courtyard. The men below rushed to defensive positions, eyes wide with anticipation and fear. Whites and White Walkers would be upon them soon. In the distance, a great swirling shadow began to crest a knoll, shapes too numerous to count. Jon knew the plan. They would fight. They would try to lure the Night King into a trap. Bran, with his green sight, might serve as bait to draw that ancient evil out. But that plan had never accounted for the monstrous presence of Viserion. That part was all but unthinkable. What could they do against dragonfire turned to chilling blue flame? The battle began swiftly, like a crack of thunder on a cloudless day. The front lines shuddered as the undead horde slammed against Winterfell's outlying defenses. Screams and the crash of arms resounded across the night. Overhead, horns blared, signaling flights of arrows. The Unsullied formed bristling phalanxes, stepping forward in unison to meet the unstoppable wave of death. The Dothraki, for those who had survived the earlier engagements, let out war cries. Their arcs gleamed with dragonglass attachments, and they tore into the enemy with savage skill. Still, for each White cut down, two more stumbled over the bodies, reaching with skeletal hands, gnashing with rotten teeth. The living retreated slowly, methodically, up the slope toward the gates, funneling the enemy into killing zones. The defenders kept a watchful eye on the skies, knowing that real terror might come from above at any moment. Daenerys and Drogon launched into the air, a blazing roar ripping through the blackness. The beast's powerful wings stirred gusts of wind through the ranks below. A great jet of dragon fire illuminated the night, a molten wave that devoured ranks of the dead in seconds. Soldiers on the ground cheered, momentarily heartened by the unearthly might of a living dragon. Rhaegal soon joined, carrying no rider, but obedient to Daenerys's mental calls, unleashing swirling plumes of orange flame. The mass of Whites felt endless. Great swirling tides of them clashed with the living, who fought valiantly but were forced to give ground in some places. The plan was to lure them deeper, funnel them, then strike with maximum force. Yet every moment that passed was a moment in which the defenders risked losing ground. Jon moved among the ranks, longclaw in hand. Valyrian steel glinted in the moonlight, cutting down one White after another. Fear gnawed at his insides, but he had no time to dwell on it. All he could do was fight, defend, and rally those around him. Arya Stark darted past him, cat-like in grace, dispatching foes with lethal swiftness. Nearby, Brienne of Tarth held the line alongside Jaime Lannister, both knights battered but unyielding. A high-pitched scream, a dragon's shriek but wrong, echoed across the battlefield. Many turned their faces to the sky in horror. There, above the swirling masses, soared Viserion. The once cream and gold dragon was now a patchwork of ragged flesh and exposed bone, eyes blazing with a ghastly blue hue. The sight was enough to freeze men's blood. Jon felt the breath leave his lungs as that monstrous shape circled overhead, letting out a cry that rumbled with unnatural echoes. It unleashed a torrent of icy flame upon the living, scattering archers along the ramparts. Men screamed as the frigid inferno engulfed them. Instead of fire's usual scorching heat, this was a bizarre, freezing conflagration that consumed flesh as relentlessly as flame. Jon watched helplessly as half a battlement was shorn away by that unnatural breath, stone turned brittle, collapsing in on itself. The living tried to counter with their two dragons, but Daenerys struggled to coordinate an effective assault. Rhaegal and Drogon roared, launching themselves at their undead sibling. The sky filled with the thunder of wings as the dragons twisted, snapping jaws and colliding midair. Blue flame met orange, and the battlefield below was momentarily bathed in swirling colors of war. From the darkness of the rear ranks strode the Night King himself, silent and implacable. White Walkers fanned out around him, their armor reflecting the gloom, each wielding an ice-forged blade. As the tide of undead parted for their master, the living found themselves assaulted anew by blasts of frigid wind. The Night King had once more summoned an icy storm, swirling clouds that whipped across the battlefield, making visibility precarious. Jon cursed under his breath as snow, thick as a raging blizzard, fell in heavy sheets. In the chaos, he saw Daenerys guide Drogon downward, unleashing scorching flame in an attempt to break the lines. She succeeded in carving a path through the whites, but the Night King lifted a slender hand, his frost-blue eyes fixed on Drogon's silhouette through the maelstrom. A shimmering spear of ice formed in his grip, crackling with cold. Jon shouted an inarticulate warning, but the wind carried his voice away. The Night King hurled the spear. It tore through the air with lethal precision. At the last possible instant, Drogon banked sharply, the spear whistling past his flank, embedding instead in the ground below with explosive force, shards of ice spraying like shrapnel. Though the blow was evaded, the impact dazed Drogon, and Daenerys lost her grip momentarily. The great dragon skittered awkwardly, nearly toppling. Men on the ground scrambled away from the massive creature's thrashing tail. Jon didn't hesitate. He spotted an opportunity amid the confusion. The Night King was momentarily exposed, his White Walkers a few strides behind him. Jon charged through the swirling melee, cutting down a white that lunged in his path. Another came at him from behind, but Grey Worm's spear lanced it before it could reach Jon's unguarded back. Nodding a quick thanks, Jon continued forward, heart pounding. He thought if he could just face the Night King again, armed with long claw, perhaps, by some miracle, he could strike a blow that would save them. He neared, every muscle taut as a bowstring. The Night King turned with a preternatural calm, meeting Jon's eyes with that unreadable expression. He lifted a hand as though he might raise the dead around him. Jon steeled himself, ready to sprint, but a sudden gale of icy wind slammed him off his feet. His breath was knocked from him as he hit the ground. The Night King advanced, each step echoing impossibly loud in the swirl of the storm. Jon pushed himself up, forcing his legs to steady, Longclaw gripped so hard his knuckles turned white. But before the Night King could close the distance, a massive shape plummeted from the sky, regal. The greenish dragon slammed down to protect Jon, roaring fiercely. The ground shook and the Night King stepped back. Regal snapped his jaws, spewing a mouthful of bright flame at the ground, forcing the White Walkers to scatter. Jon scrambled to regain his footing and realized Regal was offering him a chance to break the lines, to do something drastic. The dragon's tail lashed out, clearing a path, and with a burst of adrenaline, Jon clambered onto the beast's back. He had ridden Regal only a handful of times and never in such chaotic circumstances. Yet the dragon seemed to accept him, to respond to his desperate urging. The memory of his Targaryen blood that lived in him, though he had only recently discovered that truth, seemed to forge a bond with the creature. With a powerful thrust of his hind legs, Regal launched into the maelstrom. Snow blinded Jon as they rose above the swirling chaos. Below, the battlefield was a twisting mass of shapes, impossible to make out in the storm. Off to one side, he glimpsed Drogon and Daenerys locked in aerial combat with Viserion. The undead dragon raked at Drogon with its claws, leaving streaks of black-blue blood. Drogon roared in rage and pain. Blue flame clashed with blazing fire in the sky, lighting up the storm clouds in a terrifying dance of color. Jon didn't know what possessed him in that moment, perhaps it was pure desperation, but he guided Regal toward the swirling shadows of Viserion and Drogon. If there was any chance to distract the undead beast, to help Daenerys bring it down, he had to take it. Regal roared a challenge as they neared, a burst of hot flame greeting Viserion's flank. The undead dragon recoiled, battered by the combined assault of Drogon and Regal. Yet the Night King's steed, though rotted and horrific, possessed a dreadful, tireless strength. Viserion answered with a wave of freezing breath, and Regal howled as patches of his scales cracked under the assault. The two living dragons circled the undead one, each trying to position for an advantage. Jon saw Daenerys perched on Drogon's back, her face a mask of fierce determination. Viserion let out a hideous shriek, and Jon's heart twisted at the memory of what the dragon used to be. But pity would not serve them here. This was an enemy, no matter how tragic its existence. Another collision shook the skies. Viserion's powerful jaws snapped at Drogon's neck, nearly unseating Daenerys. Regal Dove, latching onto Viserion's flank, trying to drag the undead creature away. In the tangle of wings and snapping teeth, Jon felt the world tilt violently. Regal's body lurched as Viserion's tail slammed into them. He clung desperately, pressing himself flat. In the chaos, he heard Daenerys' voice ring out. She was calling to him, though he couldn't catch the words. Regal spun away, battered. Viserion swung back toward the ground, diving amid the swirling storm. The living dragons, disoriented by the blizzard, circled overhead. Jon swallowed hard, his heart racing. He guided Regal lower, trying to peer through the flying snow. There, emerging from the gloom, was the Night King astride Viserion once more. The undead dragon's body coursed with blue energies. A swirl of white wind enveloped them both as if the storm itself obeyed the Night King's will. Jon felt a wave of dread so intense it momentarily froze the air in his lungs. He forced Regal to pivot to face the abomination that had once been Daenerys's child. There came a sudden hush in the howling wind as if the world was holding its breath for the next horror. The Night King raised an icy spear. Jon readied himself for a maneuver, but something within him surged, a fierce, reckless resolve. He guided Regal forward, pressing his knees against the dragon's flanks in an unspoken command. Regal's powerful jaws parted, unleashing a stream of bright flame directly at Viserion and the Night King. For a fraction of a second, the swirling snow parted in the heat. The Night King's form was revealed, wreathed in the warm glow of living flame, yet his unnatural powers and the nature of Viserion's undead form shielded them from complete destruction. The spear in the Night King's hand glowed an eerie blue and then shattered. Viserion roared, rearing back, disoriented. Jon seized that moment, an inexplicable compulsion urging him forward. If he could somehow break the Night King's hold on the undead dragon, if there was even the remotest chance. He urged Regal to surge nearer. The two dragons collided, the impact nearly unseating Jon. Clinging to the ridges of Regal's neck, Jon slid sideways, scraping against Viserion's bony flank. Everything spun. He found himself, for a moment, pressed between the rotting scales of Viserion and the smoother green hide of Regal. In that moment, the rest of the world fell away. He heard himself shouting, though the words made no sense. As Regal wrenched himself free of the entangled limbs, Jon lost his grip and tumbled, crashing onto Viserion's shoulder. The undead creature snapped at him, rancid breath washing over Jon in waves. Desperate, he drove Longclaw downward, anchoring himself into the ragged flesh. An unearthly wail split the air, nearly bursting his eardrums. He could feel the ice dragon's hatred radiating through every quivering muscle. He could sense the Night King's presence somewhere above, controlling this monstrous beast. But now that Jon had discovered a precarious hold on Viserion's side, he could see something else, a faint, flickering glimmer of the living creature that might still remain within those dead eyes. It might be wishful thinking, the product of an exhausted mind. Yet in that flicker, he thought he saw recognition or perhaps memory of the bond that Viserion had once held with Daenerys. Jon pressed a palm to the creature's cold hide. He had no illusions, this was madness. But he remembered how the dire wolves once responded to him, how Ghost's soul had connected with his own in some deeper sense. He remembered, too, how Regal had accepted his presence because of his Targaryen blood. Was it possible that a part of Viserion still sensed that bond? He felt an unimaginable cold, a sharp, biting presence that gnawed at his senses as if the Night King's magic bristled within every sinew. But Jon's mind, fueled by desperation, reached out with an unspoken plea. For the briefest instant, he felt an answering surge, some vestigial memory. The flash of an old memory, as if Viserion, once gentle with Daenerys, recognized the Targaryen in him. Then the moment was gone, replaced by violent thrashing as the undead dragon tried to shake him off. Jon scrambled to keep his position, the wind ripping at his hair, the storm intensifying around him. Another wave of that cold breather erupted from Viserion's throat, searing the air around them with frigid agony. He could hear a roar from Regal, an answering cry from Drogon. He didn't know how long he could stay here, but it was as if something locked him in place, compelled him not to let go. Another movement above signaled the Night King's presence, and Jon realized if he did nothing, the Night King would conjure another weapon or worse. With a surge of raw courage, Jon hauled himself further up, driving Longclaw into Viserion's side as an anchor. The ice dragon screamed again, but Jon continued, inch by inch, until he was nearly on the top ridge of Viserion's back. The wind threatened to tear him away at any moment, and the intense cold seeping from the undead flesh was numbing his limbs. But he pressed his palm again to that rotting scale, and this time, he let out a shaky breath. He tried to speak, though there was no logic in speaking to a dead beast. Yet he recalled Daenerys's words, how she once gently murmured to her dragons. The old Targaryen tradition, perhaps, or simply a show of empathy. Jon's voice trembled as he said, "You remember the warmth, don't you? You remember the mother of dragons." Maybe it was madness. The swirling storm was so loud he could barely hear himself. But in that instant, something stilled. Viserion's thrashing paused, as if caught by some unknown force. The Night King loomed above, caught unawares, his frost-rimed eyes narrowing in suspicion. Jon seized the moment, letting every ounce of willpower flow through him. He thought of how Daenerys had bonded with each dragon from the moment they hatched. He thought of his own slow realization that he, too, had Targaryen blood. He let himself feel compassion, sorrow for what this noble creature had become, and a blazing will to free it if he could. A spasm ran through Viserion, wings beating chaotically. The Night King reached out, as though to quell the beast's momentary rebellion. But Jon felt that flicker within the dragon surge to life again. For the first time, Viserion hesitated, turning its head away from the Night King's direct control. Jon felt a searing pain, like ice shards stabbing into his mind, as the Night King's power clashed with his own nascent bond. But something intangible, maybe fate, maybe the will of the old gods or the very spirit of the dragon, pulled the undead creature from the Night King's grasp. Jon sensed it. A fragment of Viserion's soul was still there, resisting. The dragon let out a heart-wrenching roar, half living, half dead. It bucked violently, nearly throwing Jon off. The Night King struggled to maintain his seat, his face rigid as he tried to dominate the dragon's will again. A swirl of cold wind erupted as if from nowhere, a wave of piercing frost that threatened to throw Jon into the void. But he clung tight, jaw clenched, refusing to surrender. He pressed his hand harder against the dragon's hide. He didn't have the words for what he was doing, no incantation or special Targaryen magic. It was only a desperate act of a man who believed in the faint possibility that even an undead dragon might still hold a sliver of life's memory. Viserion twisted suddenly, arching his neck upward. The Night King lost his balance. Jon glimpsed that pale, inhuman face twist with surprise as he was flung to one side. He tried to grab hold of the spike on Viserion's back, but a final jerk of the dragon's body sent him hurtling into the air. As if in slow motion, the Night King plummeted from Viserion's back, disappearing into the swirling storm below. An eerie hush seemed to grip the battlefield in that moment. Then, as if awakened from a nightmare, Viserion roared and began to circle downward, spiraling out of control. Jon braced himself. The undead dragon's wings were battered, the flight chaotic. They crash-landed behind a half-collapsed tower within Winterfell's walls, the force jarring every bone in Jon's body. He rolled off the dragon's back and tumbled into a snowdrift, gasping for breath. Staggering to his feet, he saw Viserion lying in a tangled heap, wings twitching. Its chest heaved, though no normal breath passed through those rotted lungs. The eyes were still that chilling blue, but their glow flickered as though uncertain. Jon approached slowly, weapon in hand, his breath ragged. He felt the raw emptiness of the cold, the sense that the Night King's presence lingered like an oil slick. A group of wights, drawn by the commotion, charged forward. Jon swung Longclaw, cutting two down in rapid succession. One nearly tackled him from behind, but he ducked in time, rolling through the snow. When he looked up, Viserion, broken, lost, lashed out with a half-hearted snap of its jaws, scattering the wights. It was a moment of savage, mindless action, but it gave Jon the seconds he needed to dispatch the rest. All around, the clamor of battle raged. Jon could hear the roars of Drogon and Rhaegal overhead, see bursts of living flame in the distance. To his left, the courtyard was swamped with wights trying to climb the walls, met by the defenders' desperate arrows and spears. But here, in this half-collapsed corner, it was just Jon and the maimed, undead dragon. He looked at Viserion and saw that flicker in the beast's eyes again, that uncertain spark. Was the Night King's hold truly weakened? Or was this just a lull before the dragon regained its full undead fury? Jon swallowed hard, stepping closer. He could almost sense the tension in the air, the sense of a half-remembered bond straining against an unholy chain. Viserion growled low, a guttural sound that vibrated through Jon's chest. He forced himself to remain still, heart hammering. Then, in a moment he never thought possible, the dragon closed its maw and lowered its battered head to the ground. It was not exactly submission, not exactly acceptance, but something in between. A ragged breath escaped Jon's lips, forming white plumes in the cold air. He dared to place a trembling hand upon Viserion's snout. The chill radiating from that flesh was like nothing he had experienced, as if every drop of warmth in the world was being sucked away. But he didn't remove his hand. He leaned forward, meeting those glowing blue eyes, and whispered, "Come back to us." He could feel his strength draining, a wave of exhaustion and cold that threatened to claim him. In some corner of his mind, he heard the battle, heard the screams, felt the earth-shaking steps of giants or trolls among the whites. But he remained, locked in a silent plea with the broken dragon. Slowly, the swirling storm overhead began to clear. He sensed, rather than saw, the Night King's presence shift across the battlefield. Perhaps he was regrouping or searching for Viserion. Perhaps he was enraged that his mount had been wrested from him, even temporarily. It didn't matter. Jon felt the living magic of Rhaegal and Drogon fighting back. He felt the warmth of Daenerys's presence somewhere above. Pain lanced through Jon's arm, so cold it felt like burning. He grit his teeth, determined not to yield. If this was the moment that could save them from the full fury of an undead dragon, he had to see it through. Time became fluid, measured in heartbeats and ragged breaths. When next he blinked, a hush had fallen over this corner of the battlefield. Bodies of whites lay scattered around. A handful of living soldiers, uncertain, stood at a distance, staring in awe at the sight of Jon Snow standing with a hand pressed to the snout of the undead Viserion. No one dared approach. Finally, with a deep, tremulous groan, Viserion shifted. The monstrous head lifted, eyes glowing with renewed intensity. Jon's heart seized with terror that the Night King's hold was reasserting itself. But the dragon did not attack. Instead, it rose unsteadily, half-spreading torn wings. Its gaze fixed on Jon, who took a step back. As if testing new boundaries, Viserion emitted a snort. The corners of its mouth parted, revealing rows of blackened teeth. But no blast of ice flame came forth. Instead, the dragon spread its wings and leapt skyward, an awkward, half-successful takeoff that left the ground trembling. With an echoing roar, it soared above the collapsed tower, circling once, as if uncertain where to go. Jon watched, a knot of astonishment in his throat. The men who had witnessed it stared as well, some crossing themselves in superstitious fear. Then, with a final swirl of the storm, Viserion vanished into the darkness above the castle's parapets, leaving Jon trembling in the courtyard. He tried to steady himself, leaning on Longclaw. Whatever had happened, the immediate threat of Viserion's relentless assault was momentarily neutralized. But the bigger question loomed. Where had the Night King gone, and what would happen now that the tenuous bond between Viserion and his former master was severed, or at least severely weakened? Jon heard a commotion at the main gates. Soldiers were rushing inside, some wounded, some frantic, spreading news that pockets of the dead were inside the walls. The entire battle was turning into a desperate struggle at close quarters. He forced himself to put one foot in front of the other, to lead where he was needed. In the following hours, Winterfell became a tempest of chaos. The living fought in cramped corridors, in half-collapsed halls. The crypts were breached, leading to unspeakable scenes of reanimated ancestors. Arya Stark led a group in the lower levels, battling whites with her fluid, deadly skill. Sansa Stark took command of the survivors, barricading them in hidden passages. The Black Night wore on, an endless churn of blood, sweat, and tears. Yet in the distance, the howling storm began to ease. The swirling clouds parted enough for the moon's pale face to shine through. Daenerys and Drogon, battered and bleeding from multiple wounds, still swooped over the castle, unleashing fire wherever the undead threatened to overwhelm a section of the defenses. Rhaegal, likewise wounded, defended the main courtyard, snapping up whites in its jaws, scattering them like broken toys. Where was the Night King? That thought nagged at Jon even as he hacked down another white in a narrow corridor. Adrenaline had carried him this far, but exhaustion was settling in, his muscles trembling. He forced himself onward. Somewhere, Bran was being guarded by Theon Greyjoy and a handful of Ironborn in the Godswood, a trap set for the Night King. If he was still following the same cold logic, that was where the final confrontation would occur. Jon pushed past the fear and forced his tired legs to carry him toward the Godswood. On the way, he encountered Samwell Tarly, pale and shaky, brandishing a dragonglass dagger. Sam looked about ready to collapse from terror and exertion, but relief shone in his eyes when he saw Jon. They exchanged only a few words. Sam was searching for survivors, trying to ensure that any bit of knowledge gleaned from the old manuscripts could still be used. As Jon passed through an archway into a courtyard leading to the Godswood, the swirl of snow subsided, revealing a haunting sight. The ancient weirwood tree stood tall, crimson leaves fluttering in the faint wind, its pale bark stained red in places by spatters of blood. Theon and his men were already forming a ring around Bran, who sat motionless in his wheeled chair. His eyes were rolled back in his head. He was warging, presumably into ravens or wolves, seeking the location of the Night King. Jon made it to them just as the air went deathly still. Then, as if stepping out of the shadows themselves, the Night King emerged, flanked by white walkers. Their frosted blades glimmered under the moonlight. Theon's men braced themselves, but fear was evident in their eyes. Jon took a position near Bran. Theon nodded, a grim determination on his face. There would be no retreat here, no surrender. Bran's eyes flickered back to normal and he spoke in a low, resonant tone. He is here for me. The Night King stepped forward, silent as ever. The White Walkers advanced, forming a line. Theon let out a roar of defiance, launching himself forward. Jon followed, Longclaw meeting the first icy blade in a shower of sparks. Theon's spear, tipped with dragoglass, found its mark on one White Walker who shattered upon contact. But there were more. The ring of steel, the crunch of footsteps on frozen ground, the labored breathing of exhausted men, it all melded into one desperate struggle. Jon parried blow after blow, nearly losing his grip at one point. A White Walker landed a glancing strike on his shoulder, and he felt a shock of cold that nearly paralyzed his arm. Still, he fought on. Theon's men fell one by one, giving everything in their final stand. Theon himself took a savage cut to his leg but forced himself upright again, glaring at the Night King with a ferocious intensity. Jon realized with a jolt that the White Walkers had parted, leaving the Night King a clear path to Bran. They were mere obstacles, meant to be brushed aside. Something vast moved in the sky above, the wind changing pitch. Then Viserion descended. Jon's heart lurched. Had the Night King reclaimed him? The undead dragon landed behind the White Walkers, snapping with feral rage. But to Jon's astonishment, Viserion turned its wrath on the White Walkers, unleashing a spray of that ice-cold breath. Though it did not incinerate them in flames, the raw magical energy was enough to knock them off balance. The Night King whirled, shock registering in those ancient, expressionless eyes. Viserion roared, stepping closer. This was a monstrous, half-dead beast acting on some primal, fragile connection. Jon wondered if the blow he'd struck against the Night King's control was enough to sever it completely, or if the creature was simply lost in some final spasm of revolt. Whatever the reason, it bought them precious moments. Theon, seizing the chance, tried to hurl a spear at the Night King. But the inhuman figure sidestepped with that unnatural grace. The spear missed, and the Night King thrust out a hand. An icy wave surged forth, slamming Theon to the ground. He lay there, dazed, blood trickling from his mouth. Jon rushed forward, raising Longclaw. He cried out, voice raw, channeling every ounce of strength left. The Night King met Jon's blade with his own ice-forged sword. Sparks flew, the clash echoing across the Godswood. The intensity of that cold aura nearly numbed Jon's limbs again, but he gritted his teeth, pushing back with all his might. For a moment, it seemed neither would yield, locked in a lethal stalemate. Viserion roared again, lurching in a half-circle behind the Night King. The monstrous head lunged forward, jaws wide. The Night King twisted, unbelievably quick, driving his sword into the dragon's snout. The creature howled in pain, blue ichor spraying across the snow. But instead of recoiling, Viserion snapped its jaws tight around the Night King's arm. That left him exposed for just an instant. Jon seized that instant with a final, desperate swing, driving Longclaw downward. The blade sliced through the Night King's torso with a sound like shattering glass. For a heartbeat, the inhuman eyes of that abomination locked on Jon's. Then the entire form splintered. Like frost fractals spreading on a window, cracks ran across the Night King's body until it crumbled, dissolving into a swirl of snow and ice shards. A silent wave pulsed outward, and the White Walkers, those who remained standing, shattered into 1,000 icy fragments. A breath later, across the battlefield, the countless whites collapsed like puppets with their strings cut. Silence descended on Winterfell, broken only by the moaning wind and the ragged breaths of the survivors. Jon stood there, chest heaving, brain struggling to register what had just happened. The Night King was gone. The dead had fallen. It was over, this battle, at least. He swallowed, turning to see Theon lying in the snow, blinking in disbelief. Bran gazed upon the scene with somber calm, as though he had seen it all in his visions and accepted its inevitability. And Viserion, the dragon, lay half-coiled on the ground, trembling, jaws still parted in that last savage action. The sword that had been driven into its snout by the Night King's final strike protruded at an awkward angle. Parts of its wings were tattered, the once majestic form battered beyond recognition. But the eyes, those blazing blue orbs, seemed dimmer now, flickering with some strange half-light. Jon approached slowly, his footsteps crunching in the frost. Blood, if that lifeless fluid could even be called blood, dripped from Viserion's wounds. With the Night King destroyed, the connection that animated the dragon might be severed as well. Or perhaps it was, in some twisted sense, free. The beast's chest rose and fell in ragged spasms. Jon recalled that moment of contact, that fleeting sense of recognition. It gave him courage now to place his hand gently on the dragon's snout again, ignoring the biting cold. Viserion stared at him, unblinking. There was no aggression. If anything, the eyes held a curious emptiness, an echo of sorrow. "I'm sorry," Jon whispered. He could do nothing else. Here lay a creature that had once soared the skies with Daenerys, vibrant and alive, reduced to a battered undead shell. Perhaps in that final moment it had broken free. He felt the faint vibration of the dragon's final breath. The wind carried a soft moan, and then the blue light in Viserion's eyes went out. The massive head sank to the ground, and Jon felt his hand slip away. The last vestige of unholy energy dissipated, leaving only an echo of what once had been. Jon stood there, head bowed in respect for the fallen. He heard footsteps behind him, Melisandre, the Red Woman, her dark robes tattered and stained. She approached with an otherworldly calm, as though guided by some prophecy to this exact spot. Her eyes, deep with ancient knowledge, studied the dead dragon's form. She knelt by Viserion's head, unafraid of the cold or the remnants of foul sorcery. Lifting her hand, she brushed her fingertips against the dragon's lifeless scales. A faint shimmer played across her face, the reflection of a distant torch. Jon could almost sense her silent prayer. For a long moment, Melisandre did not speak. Her eyes bore a sadness that defied words. Then she turned her gaze to Jon, and in that gaze, he recognized a deep acceptance of victory, yes, but also of loss. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. Perhaps it was for all who had fallen this night, or for the dragon that lay before her, or perhaps for something else entirely. The swirl of the battle's aftermath consumed Winterfell, but here, in this small corner of the courtyard, time seemed suspended. The ice dragon that had once threatened them all lay still, freed from the Night King's thrall. Melisandre's presence lent an air of solemn ritual to its final rest, as if she stood watch over something sacred. One of the last children of fire turned to darkness and then, in its final act, redeemed in a single savage bite. Jon forced himself to look away, to gather his breath and remember there was still much to be done. The Night King was gone, but the cost was immense. Bodies of the living and the dead littered the battlements, the courtyard, the halls. Wails of grief echoed through the keep. People searched for their loved ones among the fallen. Tyrion and Sansa marshaled what remained of the defenders to begin the grim task of clearing the corpses. The night felt endless, and yet a hint of dawn pressed at the horizon, a pale hue that suggested hope. Jon knew, as he watched Melisandre standing vigil over the dead dragon, that this was only one battle in a realm full of struggles. But it might well have been the most crucial. With the Night King defeated, the great war that united the living could reach its conclusion. He turned, stepping past the body of Viserion. Warm tears blurred his vision. He remembered how Daenerys had spoken so lovingly of her dragons, calling them her children, how they had once soared together over the narrow sea. A pang of guilt tore at him for not being able to save Viserion in a truer sense, to bring him back to real life. But the powers that bound him to the dead had been undone, and perhaps, in the last seconds, the dragon found some measure of peace. Melisandre's voice finally broke the hush. The Lord of Light has reclaimed what darkness stole. Her tone was hollow, subdued. May his final rest be unburdened by shadows. Jon paused, unsure of how to respond. He only nodded, forging a silent kinship in their shared grief and relief. Melisandre's role in the battles against the darkness had often been enigmatic. She had brought him back from the brink of death once before. Now she stood over this broken dragon as though offering a final farewell on behalf of Lawler, or on behalf of the living, or perhaps simply on her own behalf. She looked at Jon then, her red hair unbound in the wind, face pale but resolute. This was always part of the vision, she murmured. A dragon wreathed in ice, the wolf-blooded king, the break in the darkness. She sighed. Visions are never clear. Sometimes the Lord of Light shows us only shadows on a wall. Jon swallowed, memories of all the prophecies and uncertainties colliding in his head. He wanted to ask her what she had seen, what else the flames might reveal for him and Daenerys, for the Seven Kingdoms. But something in her expression told him that she had said all she meant to for the moment. He gave her a curt nod, then turned away to help with the living. The dawn had begun to glimmer, gilding the top of Winterfell's walls in a subdued glow. The fires were dying down. Groans of the wounded echoed in the courtyard. Soot and ash hung in the air like a vile perfume. Soldiers, once stoic, broke down in tears over the bodies of their friends. The immensity of the loss pressed heavily on Jon's heart. Yet in the midst of that heartbreak, a sense of wonder and relief wound through those who realized the undead had fallen silent. The watchers along the walls reported that the whites outside the castle had collapsed as well, leaving nothing but motionless corpses. The Great War, it seemed, had reached its conclusion on this terrible night. Daenerys found Jon among the milling survivors, her hair matted with soot, her face smeared with tears and grime. She dismounted Drogon in the courtyard, the great beast swaying with injuries but still standing proud. The moment she saw Jon, she stumbled forward into his arms, sobbing quietly. He held her tight, words failing him. She pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his. Viserion. I saw him fall. I saw him attack the White Walkers. I don't understand. Jon's throat felt tight. I think he broke free. For a moment, at least. Long enough to help us. A spasm of grief crossed Daenerys' face. I wanted to save him. Jon closed his eyes, remembering the warmth he'd felt from Regal when he first flew, how that was a reflection of a dragon's true nature, fire, life, freedom. He did save us. She nodded through her tears, and Jon gently guided her away from the scene, if only to spare her the sight of Viserion's battered corpse. Melisandre was still there, kneeling by the dragon's head as though on the cusp of some final rite. Daenerys took one more glance, then turned her face away. The faint rays of dawn crept higher, revealing the devastation in stark detail. Men and women wandered the courtyard, some crying out for lost loved ones, some falling to their knees in exhaustion. Arya supported an injured Gendry, her expression fierce and protective. Sansa and Tyrion coordinated relief efforts, ensuring the wounded were carried to the makeshift healing tents. Brienne and Jaime, both limping, carried Podrick, who'd taken a grievous wound, to the side. All around, the tattered remains of the alliance that had fought for life gathered in small clusters, uncertain what to do next. The entire notion of an after had seemed impossible in a war against death itself, but here it was, the living day. Jon and Daenerys did what they could to help, moving from group to group, offering words of encouragement, carrying supplies. She used Drogon to incinerate the most dangerous piles of the dead outside the walls, ensuring they could not be raised again by some leftover necromancy. Regal, though injured, assisted, setting patches of whites aflame on the outer field. Each gout of flame burned away the last ghosts of the long night's horror. At some point, Jon noticed that Melisandre was no longer by Viserion's corpse. Instead, that corner of the courtyard was empty, save for the silent figure of the dragon. Jon felt a pang of worry. He didn't know what the Red Woman might have done. But there was no sign of her. He only heard murmurs that she had walked beyond the castle walls, and some said they saw her remove her ruby necklace, stumbling into the snow until she collapsed as an old crone, dissolving into ash. Others claimed she vanished before their eyes, leaving only footprints in the drift. Jon did not know the truth of it, but he felt strangely certain she had fulfilled her final purpose. As the sunrise grew more pronounced, the first glimmer of warmth returning to the land, a hush of awe rippled through those outside the castle. The once impenetrable gloom seemed to lift, revealing the silhouettes of the two living dragons perched on ramparts. For all their injuries, they were lords of the sky, guardians of the new dawn. It was a sight that rekindled hope in even the most exhausted hearts. In the courtyard, a small cluster of people gathered around Viserion's lifeless form. Daenerys, her tears dried but her cheeks still bearing the tracks, approached with Jon at her side. She reached out to rest her hand gently on a patch of intact scale near the dragon's neck. For a moment, she closed her eyes, lips pressed in a silent goodbye. Tyrion stood at a respectful distance, his eyes brimming with sympathy. He'd come to appreciate the dragons in a way few others could. He seemed to understand Daenerys' grief as akin to losing a child. Off to the side, Ser Jorah Mormont's vacant eyes and unmoving form reminded them he had fallen sometime during the night's carnage, giving his last breath for Daenerys' safety. Another piece of heartbreak to carry forward. Softly, Daenerys spoke. We should give him a funeral worthy of a dragon. Her voice was raw. He fought for us in the end. Jon nodded, glancing at the gathered men. We'll do it now, while the day is still with us. Somewhere in the midst of the crowd, men began to gather wood, dragging broken beams and scraps from what was left of the siege weapons. They built a massive pyre in the courtyard, an undertaking that took hours. All the while, Daenerys stood watch, resolute in her grief, refusing to leave until the final rites could be performed. Jon stayed with her, organizing the men, seeing to it that they had enough space for the great dragon's body. As the sun climbed higher, the pyre was at last completed. With great effort, the men, aided by ropes and the combined might of several teams of horses, dragged Viserion onto the platform. Daenerys placed a single white lily she had found in the castle's greenhouse next to the dragon's chest, a simple gesture of farewell. Rhaegal and Drogon circled overhead, each letting out a mournful cry that echoed across the castle walls. Winterfell's courtyard was silent otherwise, the men and women of the north watching in reverent quiet. The pyre was lit in a solemn moment. Flames licked up through the kindling, climbing higher, spreading around the dragon's lifeless form. Jon stood by Daenerys' side, an arm around her shoulders as they watched the blaze grow. Tears glistened in her eyes, reflecting the flickering fire. He felt his own heartbreak as well, for this creature that had been twisted by dark magic yet found a final moment of defiance. The flames roared, crackling hungrily. The heat made the onlookers step back, but Daenerys remained close. She seemed to want to feel that warmth, that last embrace of fire that would free Viserion's spirit, letting him return to the realm of the dead with some semblance of honor. There were no grand speeches, only the crackle of the pyre and the knowledge that the sun shone overhead without hindrance, free from the clouds of an unending winter. This was an ending and a beginning. As the day wore on, the pyre burned fiercely, eventually consuming the dragon's body. Ashes rose into the sky, floating upward in tendrils of smoke. At times, the wind shifted, carrying sparks and cinders across the castle grounds. The watchers coughed, shielding their faces, but none left. It was like a vigil for all that was lost. Finally, when the flames began to recede, only the blackened bones of the dragon remained, glowing in the embers. Daenerys trembled but held herself upright, face streaked with soot and tears. Jon gently guided her away, wrapping a cloak around her shoulders. There was nothing more to do here. They walked together through the courtyard, stepping around piles of rubble and the bodies that still awaited burial. The victory was theirs, but the cost was immeasurable. Jon vowed he would see the survivors cared for, that he and Daenerys would continue to fight for a realm where such a tragedy could never happen again. They found themselves back at the ramparts where, not so long ago, they had gazed out at the approaching dead. The sun's warmth touched their faces, a gentle reminder that life persisted. Daenerys looked west, toward where King's Landing lay. Jon followed her gaze, imagining the challenges that remained. They would have to face Cersei Lannister's armies, settle the claims to the throne. But for now, in this moment, they could honor the memory of all who had fallen to secure the realm of the living. A soft flurry of snow drifted from the sky, sparkling in the sunlight. Daenerys reached out, letting a flake land on her fingertip. Jon did the same, marveling at how a new day could still hold such beauty after the terrors of the night. Beneath them, the courtyard teemed with survivors and the tasks of rebuilding. He remembered with startling clarity the moment he had put his hand on Viserion's snout, the feeling of that tenuous link that refused to let darkness reign supreme. Perhaps it was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming evil, there was a spark of hope, a seed of defiance that could never be fully extinguished. He squeezed Daenerys' hand. She turned to him, eyes red-rimmed, but the ghost of a smile on her lips. "He saved us all," she whispered. "In the end." Jon nodded, his voice equally soft. He did. They stood together, leaning on each other for support, as behind them, the last of Viserion's ashes ascended into the sky. And on the far side of the courtyard, unnoticed by most, a single red priestess was gone, leaving only the faintest imprint in the snow. The battle for the living had been won in ways no one could have predicted, forging new legends that would be told for generations. And in that quiet hush of dawn, Melisandre's silent vigil over the dead dragon stood as a testament to the price paid for salvation, and the mysterious, fleeting gift of a final chance at freedom for a noble beast once lost to the dark. Jon stood upon the battlements of Winterfell with the morning sun warming his face. The first shafts of light spilled over the high walls, illuminating the wreckage of a night that would go down in history. Where once an army of the dead had raged, now only silence remained, punctuated by the distant clatter of salvage teams and the muffled sobs of the bereaved. Snow drifted in the gentle breeze, turning gold where it caught the rays of sunlight. Winter's chill still lingered, but it no longer felt as harsh as though the dawn itself brought a promise of new life. His hand rested on the stone merlin, fingers curled around the cold surface. He had stood here days before, gazing into darkness, knowing an impossible fight awaited him. Yet they had found a victory, albeit at a horrifying cost. The once endless tide of whites lay in broken heaps outside and within the castle walls. The White Walkers were gone, shattered in the wake of the Night King's defeat. The courtyard below bustled with men and women gathering remains, organizing funeral rites, tending to the wounded. The stench of death clung to the air, though the breezes helped carry away some of that foul reminder. His eyes wandered to a small group clearing debris near a battered section of the wall. Only yesterday evening, that spot had been a vital point of defense, a place where hundreds fought desperately to keep the undead from pouring through. Now it was a tangle of broken palisades, shards of ice, and muddy, trampled snow stained in ugly red-brown. Among the living were soldiers from the north, the Vale, the Riverlands, the Reach, even Dothraki, and Unsullied. All of them, side by side, had triumphed in the darkest hour. And yet, how many had perished to make it possible? He closed his eyes. The memory of Viserion, that monstrous shape streaking through the sky on undead wings, flashed through his mind. The cold flame had ravaged the battlements. So many good men and women fell under its freezing fury. Even now, Jon could scarcely believe he had managed to break the Night King's hold on that lost creature. Part of him still felt the echo of that unnatural power thrumming inside his chest, a memory of the moment he touched Viserion's rotted scales and sensed, if only for an instant, a spark of the dragon's original soul. He shuddered, recalling how the Night King plummeted to his end, the swirling storm dissipating with him. And yet the triumph was mingled with sorrow. Viserion's final collapse, the way the dragon's blue eyes had dimmed, haunted Jon like a half-remembered dream. He was pulled from his thoughts by the sound of soft footsteps behind him. Daenerys approached with measured steps, her expression etched with grief and exhaustion. A dark cloak was draped over her shoulders, the edges still bearing smears of soot from the funeral pyre. She had spent the better part of the night tending the wounded and then assisting with Viserion's cremation. An act Jon knew was like cutting out a piece of her own heart. His arm went around her instinctively and she leaned into him, letting out a slow breath that trembled at the end. He pressed his cheek against the crown of her head. "How do you fare?" She said nothing for a time, hands curling into fists at her sides before loosening again. Her gaze drifted over the courtyard, over the broken ramparts, and finally settled on a far corner where the pyre had burned Viserion's body. Only faint wisps of smoke lingered and the ground there was covered in blackened ashes. "I've lost so much," she murmured. "We all have. But seeing his ashes at dawn, it felt final in a way I can't describe." Jon tightened his hold on her. "You gave him the funeral he deserved. He fought for us at the end." Her eyes welled with tears. "He did, didn't he? Somehow he found a way to break free." "I wish," she stopped, exhaling shakily. "I wish we could have brought him back to life, truly." Rhaegal and Drogon both called to him in the skies. I heard their roars as they fought. It was as if they recognized their lost brother still lingered somehow. Jon nodded, recalling that horrifying aerial struggle. "We can only hope his soul is at peace now." She gave a slight nod in return, though her face remained a portrait of sorrow. Gently, he guided her away from the edge, leading her down the steps to the courtyard. There was work to be done, and like it or not, they were at the center of it. Everywhere they walked, soldiers bowed their heads or paused in their tasks to salute them. Jon could see in their eyes the raw mix of hope and trauma. Many had expected to die. Many had lost friends and loved ones just hours before. Yet they persevered in the face of unimaginable horror. Grey Worm stood at the gate to the main hall, conferring with a group of Unsullied. His face remained resolute, but Jon glimpsed a deeper weariness there. The Unsullied had fought relentlessly in the front lines, suffering devastating casualties. In the same yard, the last of the Dothraki who survived the earlier battles waited to receive orders, their once proud Khalasar reduced to a fraction of its size. If there was any comfort at all, it lay in the knowledge that their sacrifice had saved Westeros from eternal darkness. Daenerys stepped forward, addressing Grey Worm quietly in High Valyrian. Jon couldn't catch every word, but he understood enough to know she was requesting a report on the wounded. Grey Worm answered concisely, sparing only a brief glance of sorrow when his gaze flicked to the blackened area where Viserion's ashes lay. He then marched away with a purposeful stride, barking orders for the Unsullied to continue clearing the bodies of whites for a final burn outside the walls. Beyond them, Gendry worked at a makeshift forge, hammering away at dull or damaged dragonglass weapons, trying to salvage what he could. He was covered in grime, blood splattered across one cheek, but his arm never ceased its tireless motion. Arya leaned against a half-ruined cart nearby, quietly guarding him as he worked. She wore an inscrutable expression, eyes flicking to every shadow as if still expecting another wave of whites to appear. When she saw Jon and Daenerys, she raised a hand in silent greeting. Jon inclined his head. He wanted to speak to her, but she waved him off with a small gesture. Later, it said. They all had their tasks, and this morning, each found purpose in simply keeping busy to ward off the ghosts of the night. Near the keep's entrance, Brienne of Tarth and Jaime Lannister conferred with Sansa Stark and Tyrion Lannister, going over lists of the lost and the living. A group of knights from the Vale assisted them, each haggard but determined. Brienne carried herself with her usual steadfast resolve, though her left arm was wrapped in a makeshift sling. Jaime supported her with one hand under her elbow whenever she faltered. Sansa's face was pale, the shock of so many losses still fresh, yet there was a hardness in her eyes that reminded Jon of everything she had survived. Tyrion's expression was subdued, as though the magnitude of the night weighed on him with unique intensity. Jon gently guided Daenerys forward. They joined the group, and Sansa's gaze met Daenerys's with a flicker of empathy. They did not exchange words of comfort. There seemed no words that could properly address what had happened. Instead, Sansa simply handed Jon a piece of parchment. "We've been counting the survivors," she said in a calm but subdued voice. "We know how many from each contingent remain. The numbers are—" She trailed off, swallowing hard. Jon scanned the parchment, trying to keep his expression neutral. The numbers were grim. The combined forces had taken staggering casualties. Many houses of the north had lost entire family lines in a single night. The Vale's knights had been cut to nearly half their original muster. The Riverlands had contributed men who now lay among the dead. The Reach contingent was small to begin with, mostly foot soldiers loyal to Daenerys after her alliance with Highgarden, but they too were decimated. And the Unsullied, once the model of martial precision and discipline, were reduced to a fraction of their former strength. Tyrion spoke next, his voice quiet and measured. "We've done what we can to see that those who've fallen are given their proper rights. Winterfell's crypts can hold no more. We're building pyres outside the walls, but we must be mindful that the stench and risk of disease might become overwhelming if we can't keep up. The bodies of the whites themselves," he shook his head. "We've begun piling them, but it will take days, perhaps weeks, to dispose of them all." Daenerys inhaled slowly, pressing a hand to her forehead as though fighting back a wave of dizziness. "Do what you must," she said, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "We cannot afford to let disease ravage the survivors. Burn them. All of them outside the walls. Winterfell's courtyard has seen too much fire and death already." Sansa cast her a sharp glance, perhaps remembering how the pyre for Viserion had burned there just this morning, but she said nothing. Instead, she stepped closer to Jon, lowering her voice. "Lord Glover's entire household is gone. House Serwyn has 2 members left. The Mormonts," her voice cracked. "I bear the raven that told me the last Mormont cousin is stationed far in the south. Lyanna Mormont fell in battle. We owe her a statue in the crypts," Jon murmured, remembering the fierce young girl who had died taking down a white giant. He could still picture her determined face as she refused to yield. "We'll see it done." He felt Daenerys's hand on his arm, a light squeeze. Sansa's gaze slid to Daenerys for a moment, and Jon thought he glimpsed the edges of a fragile understanding in his sister's eyes. The living had come together to fight for survival, and in that unity, perhaps old grudges had softened. Only time would tell if it lasted. They moved as a group to the Great Hall, where soldiers and lords alike were gathering to take stock of provisions. The hall was a shambles, tables overturned, benches broken from the scramble to repurpose them for barricades. Gaping holes in the ceiling admitted pale morning light, but also scattered snow that drifted in lazy motes to the floor. A group of northern soldiers tried to clear rubble from the hearth so they could get a cooking fire going. Men and women alike needed hot food after such a harrowing night. Davos Seaworth stood to one side, directing the salvage of whatever supplies could be found in the torn storerooms. Upon seeing the mentor, he walked over, a solemn dip of his head the only greeting. The lines in his face seemed deeper, though his gaze held the same steady warmth Jon had come to rely upon. Davos looked first at Daenerys, then at Jon. "I've not seen a battle like that in all my years," he said softly, voice tinged with sorrow and awe. "And I hope I never do again. But it's done." It is, Jon agreed, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The Night King is gone. And we survived. That has to be enough for now. Davos gave a tired nod. We'll make it enough. At least we'll try. They spent the next hour in council, though it felt strange to call it that. Most of the lords and ladies who were still able to stand gathered in a rough circle around Daenerys and Jon, with Sansa, Tyrion, Davos, and Arya nearby. Bran Stark was present as well, silently observing from his wheeled chair, his distant gaze suggesting he saw far more than anyone else. He had returned from his final warg almost unnervingly calm, as if the knowledge of the Night King's destruction was enough to center him. Theon Greyjoy, bandaged from where he had been thrown by the Night King's ice magic, stood protectively near Bran, leaning on a crutch. His face bore the faint lines of shame and pride intermingled, shame for all his past misdeeds, pride for having defended Bran in the end. Jon cleared his throat and let his gaze travel around the circle. We've come through the war that mattered, as I once said at Dragonstone. The dead are defeated. That victory belongs to every one of you and to those who gave their lives. Now we need to decide what comes next. Voices stirred. Some lords wanted to rebuild the north at once, others worried about the threat from King's Landing. Tyrion raised a hand, letting the air settle. Cersei Lannister did not send her forces to help us, despite her promise. We've had no word from the south, but I can guess she's preparing for our weakened state. Should we do nothing, she might march north once she learns of our losses. Or she may stay behind her walls, letting winter do the work of weakening us further. Jaime Lannister spoke quietly. She'll have the Golden Company at her command. I know my sister. She'll use them if she sees an opportunity. She might think we're too broken to fight back. A hush fell as the lords realized they had survived the worst night in the history of the realm, only to face more conflict. Some faces hardened, others sagged in dismay. Daenerys lifted her chin, eyes glittering with resolve. We will not allow Cersei to take advantage of our weakened state. We have 2 dragons yet, though they are injured, and enough men to mount a defense. But first, we must see to healing. Our men, our alliances, our supplies, everything must be rebuilt. There was a murmur of agreement, though some in the crowd looked uncertain. The North had always been wary of outsiders, and with their numbers so badly depleted, the notion of launching another campaign south might feel reckless. Sansa's voice rang clear, gentle but insistent. We can't ignore the threat Cersei poses. But we also cannot march our wounded south tomorrow. We must take time to regroup. If she attacks first, we'll fight on our own soil. If she remains behind her walls, perhaps we can secure an alliance with the Stormlands or the Iron Islands before we face her. Yara Greyjoy's name surfaced in that conversation. Theon assured them that Yara had reclaimed the Iron Islands from Euron, but the exact state of their forces was unknown. If she could be convinced to send her ships, they might blockade King's Landing from the sea. Yet it was all speculation. For the moment, the path forward was uncertain. Jon glanced over at Bran. His brother met his gaze with that cryptic calm. Bran seemed to sense what Jon was about to ask and said softly, I see no immediate moves from Cersei. She might wait, watch. She's cunning, if nothing else. Some of the lords shifted uneasily. They knew Bran's visions were not infallible, yet they had borne truth enough times to weigh heavily on them. Daenerys looked around the circle. Then the plan is this, we stay here for a short time to recover and rebuild what we can. Our wounded need rest. Our dragons need care. When we are strong enough, we will make our move on King's Landing. If Cersei tries to strike first, we'll defend the north and meet her with whatever force we can muster. The council acknowledged this, each lord or lady bowing their heads in acceptance. Though it was no one's ideal scenario, they could not ignore reality. War still loomed, albeit a mortal one, lacking the supernatural horror they had just endured. After the council dispersed, Jon found himself overwhelmed by the endless tasks facing him. He and Daenerys both knew they had to be present, to show the people that their king, if that was indeed what he was, and queen would stand with them through the aftermath. Yet the weight of it threatened to crush him. He reminded himself that he was not alone. Sansa and Arya worked tirelessly, each in their own sphere. Tyrion and Davos continued organizing supplies, gleaning what they could from the battered countryside. Grey Worm and the Unsullied maintained a vigilant watch, for though the undead had fallen, bandits and opportunists might yet seize on the chaos. As the day stretched on, Jon lent his strength to the men outside the castle walls, helping them stack white corpses for burning. The air was thick with the stink of decay and smoke, a nauseating blend that made his eyes water. He fought down the urge to retch, forcing himself to continue. The men needed to see him doing the same grueling labor they did. Dignity and unity were forged by such acts. He had learned at Castle Black. The more men from different houses and armies saw him sweat and struggle beside them, the more they believed in his leadership. Late in the afternoon, he found a moment to rest by a broken siege engine that had once been the first line of defense. He wiped grime from his brow, looking out across the field where the undead had charged. Rows of bodies, both men and whites, dotted the land. The cleanup would not be finished for days. He heard footsteps and turned to see Arya approach. She, too, was smudged with ash, her hair tangled. She carried her slender blade, needle, in a makeshift scabbard at her hip. Her expression was composed, but he sensed a trembling beneath her calm. She stopped a few paces from him, arms folded. "You should rest, you know." He tried to smile, though the heaviness in his chest made it difficult. "So should you." She tilted her head. "I can't rest yet. My blood's still thrumming from everything that happened. And there's too much to do." Jon motioned for her to sit on a low stack of broken boards. She joined him, and for a moment, they sat in silence, watching plumes of dark smoke rise against the pale sky. After a moment, Arya's voice dropped to a near whisper. "I saw you in the sky with him, Viserion." Jon exhaled, recalling that desperate, frigid struggle. I don't fully understand it myself. I only know that something inside that dragon recognized me, or recognized something beyond the Night King's power. I can't explain it." Arya studied him with those keen, wolfish eyes. "I'm glad you did it. You saved us all." His throat tightened. "We saved each other. I saw you fighting. I saw you protect Gendry when the Whites closed in. I saw you helping the wounded. You killed how many?" She shrugged. "Enough." A pause. "Don't call me a hero, though. We all just did what we had to do." He pressed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You always do." She nodded, then shifted her gaze to the horizon where the sun was sinking, painting the clouds in soft oranges and pinks. The day had slipped by quicker than either of them realized. Arya's voice grew distant. "Do you think it'll ever feel normal again? Or is this what our lives are now?" Jon studied the burning fields, the battered walls of Winterfell, the haunted faces of survivors. "We'll make a new normal. Maybe it won't be the same as before, but we can't let the memories of this night swallow us." A faint, rueful smile tugged at her lips. "You know, if someone had told me we'd survive the dead to go on fighting Cersei Lannister, I might have laughed in their face." He breathed a weary sigh. "It never ends, does it?" Arya shook her head. "No, but for once I'm not afraid. Not like I was of that army of the dead. A mortal enemy is different." Jon let her words sink in. A mortal enemy could be bargained with, outmaneuvered, or at least predicted. There was a sense of relief in that, twisted though it might be, compared to the terror of fighting an enemy who did not tire, did not fear, did not relent. Cersei was cunning and ruthless, but she was human. They lingered a while longer, sharing a stillness that was both comforting and sad. Then they rose, returning to the tasks before them. The fires burned late into the night, ridding the land of the last vestiges of the White Army. Tyrion oversaw much of the work himself, pacing along the ramparts with a goblet of watered wine. He made sure the men rotated shifts and that no one was too close to the flames for too long. He forced them to hydrate, to rest in turns. If they had no time to grieve properly now, at least he would see that they survived the cleanup. As darkness fell, Winterfell's courtyard became a quiet realm of flickering torchlight. Some corners had been set aside for the wounded. Makeshift tents and bedrolls lined the outer walls. Grand Maester Wolkan and a handful of healers from the citadel scurried between them, administering poultices and bandages. Daenerys had demanded that the wounded Unsullied and Dothraki be treated no differently than any northern soldier. And so the men from the north shared small fires with men from across the narrow sea. Their mutual suffering forged unexpected bonds. Jon found Daenerys by one such fire, kneeling beside a badly injured Dothraki rider. She spoke to him in the Dothraki tongue, her voice gentle. The man's face was twisted in agony, but as Daenerys laid a comforting hand on his brow, he calmed. She took a wooden bowl from a healer, helping the rider sip a bitter concoction meant to ease pain. Jon hovered back a moment, letting her finish. Her presence was radiant in the torchlight, like some living flame of compassion amid all this ruin. He felt a twinge of awe, remembering how some had called her the Breaker of Chains, the Mother of Dragons, titles that seemed almost too grand to bear. Yet she carried them with humility, even in her grief. When she rose, he offered her a hand. She accepted, steadying herself. Shadows under her eyes told him she was exhausted, but she still summoned a faint smile. "He'll recover," she said, her voice subdued. He took a serious wound to the side, but the healers believe it missed his vital organs. Jon nodded. "Then there's hope." She looked around at the rows of injured. "There must always be hope, or we wouldn't bother tending any of them. I wish I could do more. It doesn't feel like enough." He understood that weight. He had felt it often enough as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and again when he became king in the north. "You're doing what you can," he said quietly. "They need to see you here. They need to see that you care." She glanced at him, the edges of her weary smile warming. "I'm lucky to have you by my side, Jon Snow." He gently brushed a stray lock of her silver blonde hair behind her ear. "We'll get through this, one step at a time." She nodded, though her gaze slipped past him to where, earlier that morning, Viserion's pyre had turned to ash. He could sense her unspoken thoughts. The war against the dead was done, but not without a horrific price. She had lost one dragon north of the wall, only to lose him again in the final battle. Still, what he had done, managing to free that dragon from the Night King's grip, if only at the end, might have spared them all a more terrible fate. One day, perhaps, that would be a source of solace rather than heartbreak. They spent another hour among the wounded, then retreated to the Great Hall. The battered structure had been partially cleared of debris. A crude array of unbroken chairs and tables was arranged near the western side, forming a space where those not on duty could rest or share a brief meal. The fireplace had been cleaned, and a fresh fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, a cold wind picked up, whistling through the missing stones in the upper walls. Tyrion was there, along with Brienne, Jaime, Sansa, Davos, and a handful of knights from the Vale. Arya and Gendry joined soon after. They ate in silence at first, lumps of stew that tasted of barley and leftover cuts of goat. The meager meal was enough to sustain them, though no one felt particularly hungry. The hush settled, broken only by the snap of the fire and the occasional clank of a spoon against a bowl. Finally, Tyrion cleared his throat. "We should drink to the memory of Viserion." He raised a wineskin in a gesture that was half solemn, half wry. "I usually choose something witty, but I have no wit left tonight." A fleeting hint of amusement touched Daenerys's face, but her voice was quiet as she responded, "Thank you, Tyrion. That means more than you know." They passed the wineskin around, each taking a small sip. Then they lapsed back into reflective silence, thinking of all the souls lost. Lyanna Mormont, Ed Tollett, Beric Dondarrion, and countless others. Grey Worm's mind, no doubt, lingered on the unsullied who had fallen. Sansa grieved for the many northern families she had come to rely upon. Davos for the men who had trusted him. Brienne and Jaime had fought side by side. Both nearly lost their lives. Gendry had seen many of his blacksmith helpers torn apart. Arya had not spoken of her own wounds. The stoic set of her shoulders told Jon she was dealing with them in her own way. The night pressed on. Some found corners to doze, heads resting on arms or cloaks. Others drifted away, returning to their duties or to check on the wounded. By the time Jon and Daenerys sought out a quiet room in one of the upper floors, the castle had slipped into a near slumber, the hush of exhaustion blanketing everything. They entered a small bedchamber that had once been used by a lesser Stark retainer. The walls were plain stone, the window covered by a tattered curtain that flapped gently in the draught. A single bed, though large enough, stood against the wall, its sheets likely changed by some quick-minded steward earlier in the day. Jon helped Daenerys out of her cloak. She removed her boots and sat heavily on the edge of the bed, shoulders slumping. He lit a simple oil lamp, the yellow glow revealing how tired she truly was. "Come here," she said softly, extending a hand. He joined her, feeling the swirl of conflicting emotions in his chest. She leaned her head against his shoulder. For a time they sat in silence, the day's events sinking into their bones. It felt like the castle itself was holding its breath, uncertain whether more calamities lay in wait. Jon brushed his thumb over the back of her hand. "I wish I could promise you peace from here on out." She let out a quiet laugh that held no amusement. "I've never known true peace. I doubt I'll start now. But if there's any comfort to be had, it's that we face living enemies, not the dead. That alone feels like a mercy." He nodded. "We'll gather our strength. We'll find a way to unify whoever's left. Maybe Yara Greyjoy, maybe the Stormlands. Even Dorne might rally." Daenerys lifted her eyes to his, searching. "And after that? When the Iron Throne is ours, what then?" Jon's throat tightened. He remembered how the very question of ruling had weighed on him. He still carried a quiet dread at the thought of proclaiming his true parentage. Those who had accepted him as king in the north might not be so eager to follow him once they learned he was a Targaryen by birth. And Daenerys, she was rightful queen by her own claim, by her blood and her conquests. He squeezed her hand, voice hushed. "We do better than those before us. We break the wheel, as you once said." She managed a faint, thoughtful smile. "Break the wheel? It's what I've wanted all along. But the cost? I never knew it would be so high." He kissed her temple, letting the warmth of her presence ground him. "Rest," he said gently. "We'll face tomorrow's challenges as they come." She nodded, allowing him to help her lie down. He removed his own boots and cloak, doused the lamp until only the faint glow of moonlight through the window remained. When he slipped under the blankets beside her, she curled against him, her breath shallow and uneven. He wrapped an arm around her waist. Outside, the wind whispered across the courtyard, carrying the soft crackle of distant fires. He closed his eyes, telling himself that for one night they could allow exhaustion to claim them. And so, in each other's arms, they drifted off to a rest. Less sleep, haunted by dreams of what had been and what was yet to come. Morning came slowly, pale gray light filtering through the window. Jon woke to find Daenerys already gone from the bed, the hollow left by her body cool to the touch. He sat up, raking a hand through his tangled hair. His entire body felt stiff, battered. His left shoulder ached from where a white had nearly torn his arm off. He swallowed a groan, willed himself to stand. Outside, he could hear the low buzz of the castle stirring to life, or what was left of it. When he stepped into the corridor, a passing steward offered a quick bow. Jon recognized the young man as one of the Stark retainers. He asked if he had seen Daenerys. The steward nodded. "The queen is with the dragons, my lord." Jon thanked him and made his way outside. The morning air was crisp, but not as brutally cold as before. Winter remained, but the thick clouds overhead had parted enough for a faint sun to peek through. He found Daenerys in the courtyard near the southern wall, accompanied by Missandei and Grey Worm. Drogon and Rhaegal loomed behind them, each sporting fresh wounds that were partially bandaged with wide strips of cloth. Maesters and a few former pit fighters from Meereen who had knowledge of healing large creatures stood at a cautious distance, attempting to dress the dragon's injuries. Daenerys stroked Drogon's muzzle with a gentle hand. The mighty dragon snorted, a puff of hot breath condensing in the cool air. Rhaegal watched, tail lashing irritably now and then, as though the bandages chafed. The memory of both dragons battling Viserion was fresh in Jon's mind. He drew closer, noticing the deep gashes along Drogon's flank, claw marks from that undead fight. Rhaegal had a ragged tear in one wing, though the maesters assured them it would mend enough for flight, given time. Daenerys turned when she heard his footsteps. Her face was lined with concern, but she managed a mild smile. "Good morning." He nodded a greeting, resting a hand lightly on Rhaegal's flank. The dragon let out a low rumble, not exactly welcoming but acknowledging him. He could sense the creature's pain and agitation. "How are they?" he asked. She sighed. "Healing slowly. Drogon hates being confined. Rhaegal at least tolerates it better. Neither can fly far until the tears are mended. It could be weeks before they can take to the skies without risk." Jon felt a wave of relief, at least it wasn't permanent. They deserve the rest after everything they've done. Grey Worm stepped forward, saluting Daenerys. "Your Grace, the Unsullied stand ready for orders. Should we continue fortifying Winterfell, or do you wish us to send scouting parties south?" Daenerys hesitated, glancing at Jon. He stepped in, addressing Grey Worm. We'll send small scouting parties, yes, but not too far. Focus on the roads leading into the Neck, see if there's any sign of Lannister or Golden Company forces moving north. Grey Worm nodded curtly. Missandei, standing to one side, offered Jon a polite bow as well. Though she was no warrior, she was invaluable in matters of language and administration, especially with the North not always accustomed to dealing with foreign armies. She had spent much of the previous night cataloging the supplies that remained: grain, hay, meat, wine. The results had been sobering. Winterfell's stocks were dangerously low after hosting such a large force, and the long night had only just ended. Jon told Grey Worm to coordinate with the northern scouts as well to ensure no group was left isolated or outnumbered. The commander bowed again and departed, Missandei trailing after him. That left Jon and Daenerys alone with the dragons, aside from a few nervous maesters who continued applying salves to Drogon's wounds. She took Jon's hand, pulling him gently toward Drogon's side. The dragon lowered his head, letting out a rumble that caused the maesters to jump back. But Daenerys remained calm, stroking one of the dragon's horns. Easy, she murmured. They're here to help you. Drogon snorted, though the tension in his posture eased. For a moment, Jon marveled at the bond between Daenerys and her dragons, a connection built from the day they hatched. It reminded him of the spark he'd felt with Rhaegal in the sky, the unstoppable sense that dragons recognized Targaryen blood. Then he recalled the even stranger moment with Viserion, twisted though it was by dark magic. A pang of grief flickered through him again. Daenerys must have sensed the shift in his mood. She tilted her head, eyes searching his. It still hurts, doesn't it? Viserion. He nodded, voice low. I can't shake the memory of him or how it felt when I touched him. It was like staring into a mirror that showed only pain. She let out a trembling breath. I tried so many times to think if there was a way to truly save him, to bring him back to life, not just as a white. But no such magic exists, at least none that anyone has ever found. And perhaps even if it did, it would require a sacrifice we couldn't bear. Jon didn't doubt that. The old stories of blood magic, the legends of resurrection that Melisandre had invoked for him, they all carried terrible costs. He reached out and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You saved countless lives by hatching these dragons at all. And in the end, Viserion made a choice, or something in him did. She leaned into his touch for a moment, letting her grief mingle with gratitude. Then she squared her shoulders, a steel returning to her eyes. We should speak to Sansa. Let's see how quickly we might reach out to the other lords who owe the North allegiance. We need to know who's still alive, who might send men or supplies. He agreed. They left the dragons in the care of the maesters and guards, heading across the courtyard to the main keep. On the way, they passed the area where Viserion's pyre had been, now little more than a blackened patch. Someone had cleared the bones, or what remained of them, likely burying them outside the walls. Daenerys paused only briefly, eyes flicking to that spot. Then she continued on, her jaw set. Sansa was in the solar, seated at a table strewn with maps and parchments. She had dark circles under her eyes, but her posture was poised as she conferred with Tyrion and Davos. The moment Jon and Daenerys entered, Sansa set aside the quill she had been using to make notes. Tyrion turned in his chair, beckoning them to join. Daenerys settled into a seat, scanning the documents. Any news from the ravens we sent? Tyrion shook his head. Not yet. We've asked every remaining maester to send word to the major seats in the north as well as to the Riverlands and the Vale, letting them know the threat of the dead is ended. We requested supply shipments, men willing to join our cause against Cersei. It's too early for any replies to have arrived. Sansa tapped one of the maps with a slender finger. Lesser houses in the north might respond quickly if they're able. Many are likely destroyed or scattered, but some might remain. The Karstarks, the Riders, the Manderleys, the White Harbor was said to be facing its own shortages. We can't count on them for more than a trickle of grain. Davos cleared his throat. Once the roads are passable, we might send men south to the Riverlands for trade. House Tully, if they still have enough resources, might help. But as far as I know, Edmure Tully is still captive in the Twins or King's Landing. Jaime, do you have any idea what happened after Walder Frey's demise? Jaime's voice came from the door as he stepped in, leaning on a cane. I heard rumors that Arya Stark ended House Frey, or at least their leadership. His gaze flicked to Arya, who had just slipped in behind him. She said nothing, but there was the barest hint of a smirk at her lips. Jaime continued, if that's true, the Tully bannermen might have reclaimed Riverrun by now. But I can't confirm it. Either way, the Riverlands were hard-pressed by conflict even before this. They may be reluctant to provide much aid. Jon let out a slow exhale. It was a grim situation, but not hopeless. They had to be methodical. We'll keep sending ravens, keep lines of communication open. We won't move on King's Landing until our forces are somewhat replenished. The men deserve time to recover. Sansa nodded, exchanging a glance with Daenerys. That seems wise. And in the meantime, you'll remain here at Winterfell. Daenerys's expression was unreadable for a moment, and Jon sensed the tension in the question. Winterfell was the Stark ancestral seat, but it was also the stronghold from which he, as king in the north, had once ruled. Now Daenerys was here as queen, and the lines of authority were blurred. Jon put a hand on the table, meeting Sansa's gaze. Yes, we'll remain. The men need a united command. We still have Rhaegal and Drogon to consider, and they won't be fit for extended travel for some time. Sansa took a breath, then nodded. Very well. I'll continue working with Tyrion and Davos to coordinate. We'll do our best to see that the North's people are fed as well. The next few weeks will be crucial. We have a lot of funerals to arrange. Families to notify. Daenerys' voice softened. I'll help you in any way I can. Arya crossed her arms, leaning against a wall behind Sansa. I'll go where I'm needed, but if you want me to deliver any messages, I can do that too. I'm better on the road than playing at courtesies. A wry grin tugged at Tyrion's lips. I can't think of a better messenger for certain tasks than the deadliest person in the Seven Kingdoms. But let's hold off on sending you off alone just yet. We need you here, if only to keep our enemies from slipping a knife in any of our backs. Arya gave a small shrug, neither accepting nor rejecting the notion. The meeting ended soon after, with everyone returning to their myriad tasks. The days that followed were filled with grueling labor and slow healing. Jon oversaw the burials and burning of the fallen, while Daenerys spent her hours among the wounded, encouraging them, ensuring the maesters had everything they needed. Sansa and Tyrion coordinated supply routes, sending scouting parties to outlying farms. Davos joined them, using his years of smuggling experience to figure out how best to distribute limited resources. Grey Worm disciplined the remaining Unsullied, preparing them for a potential southern campaign and also organizing them to help around the castle in tasks normally left to servants. Every spare hand was needed. One evening, after a long day spent clearing rubble from the battered walls, Jon climbed to the top of Winterfell's highest tower. The sky was a deep, star-flecked purple, and a cold wind whipped at his cloak. He leaned against the old stone, letting the quiet of the heights surround him. He heard footsteps and moments later found Bran at his side, his chair pushed by Theon. Theon gave Jon a curt nod, stepping back to let them speak privately. Bran gazed across the ramparts with that same distant expression. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, almost too calm. I've seen glimpses of what might come. The future is not fixed, but the threads of fate are entangled around King's Landing. Jon swallowed, looking at his brother. What did you see? Bran blinked slowly. Ships from the Iron Islands flying the Kraken banner. Soldiers wearing the Golden Company's elephant sigil disembarking at King's Landing's docks. Cersei standing on the Red Keep's balcony, watching them fill the streets. It means she's gathering strength. She waits, fortifying her position while we recover. Jon exhaled a thin plume of breath into the cold air. Then she means to outlast us or strike when she thinks we're weakest. She's cunning, Bran replied, but the realm might turn against her once word spreads that she did nothing to help fight the dead. Many lords might question her claims. And if they see you and Daenerys as saviors? Jon's jaw tightened. That might help. But fear and gold can sway people quickly. We can't rely on gratitude alone. Bran studied him. You haven't told everyone the truth about your lineage yet. A flush of apprehension sparked in Jon's chest. No, I haven't. Not widely, at least. Only a few know. Bran nodded. Are you planning to keep it that way? Jon gazed at the flickering torches below in the courtyard, thinking of the men who followed him, the families who had named him king in the north. The north named me king because they saw me as Ned Stark's son, a northerner, a Stark. If they learn I'm actually the son of Rhaegar Targaryen, he paused, swallowing. I don't know what they'll do. Bran's voice was gentle. You can't hide from the truth forever. People will find out in time. Jon stared at the darkness. I know. But right now, the realm's fragile. I don't want to break what unity we have left. Bran said nothing more, as if he accepted Jon's dilemma. He only turned his gaze outward again, the wind shifting the fur along his shoulders. Theon stood quietly behind the chair, eyes lowered. Jon let out a soft sigh. Thank you, Bran. For everything you did. Bran inclined his head. I did only what I was meant to do. The Night King is gone. The rest is up to us. Jon gripped Bran's shoulder gently, then nodded at Theon before stepping away. He descended the winding staircase, each echoing footstep reverberating in the still air. When he reached the corridor, he saw Ghost waiting for him, his dire wolf, forstained from the battle but alive and faithful. Jon knelt, running a hand over Ghost's ears. The wolf pressed closer, whining softly. In that moment, Jon felt a surge of comfort he couldn't quite explain. Ghost had been with him through so much. He was a reminder of Jon's Stark heritage, a tie to a life that had shaped him even if his blood told a different story. The next morning, ravens arrived from a scattering of northern houses. Some messages were heartbreaking, entire families wiped out, holds burned, or overrun by wights that had only collapsed once the Night King died. Others offered a trickle of hope. The Manderleys had survived, albeit with losses. They promised what little grain they could spare. House Royce of the Vale sent word that they, too, would stand by the Stark-Targaryen alliance for now, though their men needed time to recover from the battle. A few days later, a raven arrived from the Iron Islands. Yara Greyjoy had reclaimed most of the territory, forcing Euron's men out. She offered ships and safe harbor if Daenerys and Jon needed a naval force to challenge Cersei. She had heard of Theon's deeds at Winterfell and expressed pride, though she made no mention of wanting him to return. Theon read the parchment with a tremor in his hand, relief mingled with shame. "I'd like to sail to her eventually," he said to Jon, "but not until you no longer need me here." Jon clasped Theon's shoulder. "We'll need all the help we can get rebuilding. When the time comes, we'll arrange passage for you." Days bled into weeks. Winterfell slowly mended. Structures were repaired enough to shield inhabitants from the harshest weather. Wood and stone were hauled from neighboring areas, though resources were scarce. The towers were reinforced, rubble cleared. The courtyard was smoothed of the deep gouges left by the massive white army. Pyres still burned beyond the walls, but each day fewer bodies needed tending. The castle felt more like a sanctuary than a battlefield, though the scars remained. Word of the victory spread throughout the north and beyond, reaching some pockets of the Riverlands and the Westerlands. Stragglers from distant corners, survivors of the undead onslaught, made their way to Winterfell, hoping for protection or to find lost kin. Jon and Daenerys greeted them with as much kindness as they could offer, though the stores of food were dangerously low. Nevertheless, no one was turned away unless they presented a threat. The dragon's wounds healed gradually. Rhaegal regained enough strength to take short flights around Winterfell, though Daenerys insisted he not push himself too hard. Drogon, ever stubborn, tried to fly despite his injuries and once gave the entire castle a scare when he roared his frustration at being grounded. Still, by the end of the third week, the two dragons soared together for a brief circuit above the ramparts, eliciting cheers from the inhabitants below. Amid these small victories, tensions simmered over who would ultimately rule. The lords of the north had sworn to Jon, but many recognized Daenerys as their queen, if only out of gratitude for her role in the war. Jon and Daenerys made a point of presenting a united front, refusing to be drawn into discussions of succession until the threat from Cersei was dealt with. That kept most of the grumbling at bay, though a few older northern lords, men who had once cursed the Targaryens, whispered among themselves. Sansa, keen-eared and politically astute, kept Jon informed of such murmurs. One evening, while reviewing supply lists with Sansa, Tyrion, and Davos, Jon found himself thinking of his parentage again. He wondered if he should simply reveal it, let the realm decide. Perhaps the knowledge would galvanize people to unite under Daenerys if they felt betrayed by the revelation that their beloved king in the north was actually a Targaryen. Or perhaps it would sow chaos, splitting loyalties. He pictured the north feeling cheated and manipulated, conjuring images of Aerys the Mad King's cruelty. He could see them turning on Daenerys out of fear. The thought unsettled him, so he buried it, telling himself the time was not yet right. Daenerys sensed his inner conflict, though he never spoke of it openly. At night, they held each other close, sometimes discussing the upcoming war with Cersei, sometimes letting the quiet say all that needed to be said. Each day, they drew strength from each other's presence, forging a bond that felt both comforting and precarious. At last, scouts returned from the south with solid news. The Golden Company was indeed gathering in King's Landing, along with whatever remained of the Lannister forces. Euron Greyjoy's fleet controlled the waters off Blackwater Bay, though Yara contested some routes. Cersei had not yet marched north, but her army was growing in number. Mercenaries from across the narrow sea had been enticed by the prospect of Lannister gold swarming to her banner. The scouts believed she would remain behind the walls of King's Landing, daring Daenerys and Jon to besiege her. When Jon shared this news with the senior members of their alliance, reactions were mixed. Some urged an immediate campaign south, worried that Cersei's defenses would only solidify further. Others argued they should wait for winter to lessen its grip, or at least wait for the dragons to fully recover. Ultimately, Daenerys and Jon decided to begin preparations to march in the coming weeks once a minimal harvest could be brought in from the local fields. Winter in the north was harsh, but they prayed the worst of it had passed after the fall of the Night King. On the night the decision was made, the Great Hall of Winterfell hosted a modest feast of boiled turnips, salted fish, and weak ale. It was a sad echo of the banquets once held, but it allowed the men a moment of camaraderie. Jon noticed that in the weeks since the battle, northern soldiers had grown more accustomed to the presence of the unsullied and Dothraki. They drank together, shared stories of the fight against the undead. Some used sign language or improvised gestures to communicate with the unsullied, forging unlikely friendships. Dean. Rhys sat beside Jon at the head table, though it was really just a sturdy plank across two barrels. Most of the original furniture had been destroyed. Tyrion was nearby, chatting with Sansa, who responded with occasional wry remarks. Davos laughed with Grey Worm at something the commander had signed about the Dothraki's skill with horses. Gendry and Arya stood at the edge of the gathering, sipping small cups of ale, occasionally glancing at each other with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Brienne and Jaime found a place near the center, quietly sharing a simple meal in comfortable silence. Bran joined briefly, though he often gazed into the distance, not quite present. Jon leaned toward Daenerys, voice low to avoid interrupting a half-drunken song that had broken out among a handful of soldiers. "It's not much of a feast, is it?" She offered a small smile. "It's enough. They need this, a moment to feel alive." He studied her face, the shadows cast by flickering torchlight. "And you? Do you feel alive?" She hesitated. "I feel hopeful and afraid in equal measure. I've lost so much to reach this point. We both have. But we're still here." She looked around at the soldiers, the lords, the handful of women who helped serve the modest meal. "Whatever happens next, we'll face it together." Jon reached under the table and found her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Yes, we will." They stayed a while longer, sharing quiet conversation. When the night wore on and the men grew rowdy with ale, Jon and Daenerys slipped away to walk the ramparts. Snow drifted down in delicate flakes, illuminated by torches set along the parapets. The air was cold enough that their breath plumed before them, but the wind had calmed, making it bearable. Below, the courtyard bustled with men settling into tents or corners of the keep for the night. Atop the wall, a hush surrounded them. Daenerys paused near a crenellation, gazing out at the wide swath of land beyond. "It's hard to believe, isn't it?" she mused softly. "All that talk of the dead marching on us, that hopeless night, and now it's just snow and quiet." Jon joined her, setting a gloved hand on the cold stone. "We achieved the impossible. For all the cost, we did it." She turned to him, eyes gleaming with the reflection of torchlight. "What do you want, Jon Snow?" "Truly want?" He inhaled sharply, momentarily at a loss. She deserved the truth, but it was tangled in 1,000 doubts. "I want peace. I want the people I care about to survive. I want to keep the promises I've made. And I want to see you get what you fought for all your life." Her gaze flickered with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I asked myself that question many times ever since I first learned I might have a claim to a throne across the sea. At first, I wanted the Iron Throne because it was mine by birth. Then I wanted it to liberate those who suffered as I once did. Then I wanted it because I believed it was my destiny. Now." She trailed off, exhaling a plume of frosty air. "Now I'm not sure what the throne means to me except that I want to create a better world." He understood that turmoil. Gently he reached out, resting his palm against her cheek. She leaned into his touch. In that quiet moment, the snow drifted around them and the torches flickered in the faint breeze. They heard a roar above and both looked up to see the silhouette of Rhaegal gliding in lazy circles, his movements less labored now. Drogon followed, though more slowly, still bearing bandages along one flank. The sight stirred something bright within Jon. The dragons were a symbol of life's resurgence after the long night. One had been lost, yes, but these two remained battered yet unbroken. Daenerys watched them for a long while, her eyes shining. Then she returned her gaze to Jon. "When we march south, it will be war again. Men will die, and these walls will be left behind. Are you ready for that?" He swallowed, recalling the unspeakable carnage he'd already witnessed. "I'm not sure anyone's ever ready for war, but I'll do what I must." She lowered her head, pressing her forehead gently against his. "We'll face it together then." They lingered on the battlements until the cold drove them back inside. Over the next fortnight, preparations intensified. Horses were readied, wagons prepared, new weapons forged, mostly steel now, though a few leftover dragon glass blades remained. Scouts continued to track any sign of Lannister or Golden Company movement in the Riverlands. Ravens flew in and out daily, bearing updates from lords near and far. Supplies trickled in from distant corners of the north and from the Vale, never enough but sufficient to feed the forces for the moment. Eventually, the day came when Daenerys and Jon declared it was time to depart. Not everyone would go south immediately. Sansa would remain in Winterfell with enough men to maintain order and defend the seat should any remaining threat appear. Arya, however, chose to accompany Jon and Daenerys, along with Davos, Tyrion, Grey Worm, the Unsullied, and what was left of the Dothraki. Bran, too, decided to stay in Winterfell, saying only that his place was in the north. Jaime and Brienne, to Jon's mild surprise, volunteered to ride with the main host. Gendry, for reasons he didn't share, decided to join them as well, forging new weapons at each stop along the way. The farewell at Winterfell was subdued, lacking the pomp that might have once accompanied a royal departure. Sansa embraced Jon tightly. "Take care, you stubborn fool," she murmured, tears in her eyes. "And come back alive." Jon gave her a faint smile, pressing his forehead to hers in a sibling's gesture of affection. "I will. And you keep Winterfell safe." She nodded, lips trembling. To Daenerys, she offered a short bow. "I trust the Queen will watch over my brother," she said softly, glancing up into Daenerys' eyes. Something unspoken passed between them. A recognition of shared burdens. Daenerys dipped her head in return. Then it was time. The gates opened and a column of soldiers trudged out into the snowy expanse. Horses snorted, breath steaming. The banners of House Stark and House Targaryen fluttered side by side in the cold wind. At the front rode Jon and Daenerys. Rhaegal soared overhead, still healing but able to fly short distances. Drogon remained just behind, occasionally kicking up drifts of snow with mighty beats of his wings. Winterfell's inhabitants lined the walls, watching them depart. A hush fell, save for the rhythmic crunch of hooves and boots on packed snow. Jon felt a tightness in his chest as he left the castle behind. Winterfell was home, always had been in his heart. But now he rode south, uncertain of what lay ahead. Daenerys guided her horse beside his, their shoulders nearly brushing. He reached out and found her gloved hand, squeezing it briefly before letting go. She offered a determined nod. This was it, the next chapter in their war-torn lives. Ahead stretched the King's Road, winding through the snowy landscape. The air smelled of pine and frozen earth. The men behind them were weary but resolute. They had survived the dead, they would survive this too, or so they believed. In the distance, Rhaegal let out a roaring call echoed by Drogon. Their silhouettes glided across the sky, a herald of fire in a land of ice. Jon wondered if the ghosts of the long night would ever truly leave them. Even now, when he closed his eyes, he could see that terrible moment of undead Viserion raining down frigid blue flame. He could feel the Night King's presence, icy and malevolent. But that threat was gone, banished by steel and dragonfire and a final act of defiance from the dragon that would have destroyed them all. Jon carried that memory as both a burden and an emblem of hope. They pressed on. Day after day, the party traveled south, the land slowly changing from deep winter to fields touched by only a light frost. They would stop at towns where the inhabitants emerged, wary at first, then relieved to learn the rumors were true, the dead were defeated. Some villages offered what little supplies they could spare, though fear still lingered in the eyes of many. The sight of dragons overhead elicited awe and dread in equal measure. The nights passed in a series of campsites ringed by sentries. Each evening, Daenerys took to conversing with the men, sometimes sharing a modest meal in the open. Jon joined her, silently grateful for the sense of solidarity it inspired. Arya often disappeared for hours, scouting the perimeters, returning with reports of any suspicious movement. Theon, though his legs still caused him pain, stood guard stoically by Bran's messenger ravens, which flew from camp to camp carrying updates and letters. Gendry, for his part, frequently lit a small forge, shaping arrowheads and repairing weapons. Tyrion and Davos used the downtime to plan strategy, hunched over maps by lantern light. One moonlit evening, as Jon gazed into the flickering flames of the campfire, he felt Daenerys settle beside him. She wore a thick fur cloak against the chill. Gently, she placed her hand atop his. He turned to look at her, caught by the softness in her eyes. "I was thinking of the moment we parted ways at the wall," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the crackle of firewood. "It feels like a lifetime ago." He nodded, recalling that uncertain time before they truly understood each other. "It does." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the distant calls of men preparing for bed, the shuffle of horses, and the gentle roaring of dragons perched on a nearby hillside. Then Daenerys' gaze dropped to the flames. "I'm afraid, Jon," she admitted. Not of Cersei so much as of what comes after. If we manage to take the throne, if we unite the realm, will we just become the next story of a ruler who falls to madness or cruelty? So many Targaryens have walked that path. Jon gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. You're not alone. You have your advisors, your allies, and you have me. You're not the Mad King. You've shown mercy, compassion. Yes, you can be fierce, but you've always tempered that fierceness with justice. She studied his face, searching for any hint of doubt. Thank you for believing in me. A tremor wavered in her voice, but then she drew a calming breath. We both bear heavy burdens, but let's face them together. He tilted his head, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Always. A few of the men nearby glanced their way, noticing the quiet exchange, but no one commented. Rumors of their closeness had spread, of course, yet the men had grown used to it, or saw it as a sign of unity. Whatever concerns might arise about the Targaryen line were overshadowed by gratitude for victory over the dead. For now, at last, they reached the edges of the Riverlands, where the snows began to thin and the King's Road grew muddier. The sky remained overcast, but the biting chill lessened. Scouts reported that some of the local lords were willing to let them pass, perhaps even join them, though many were cautious about confronting Cersei. The Riverlands had changed hands so many times that loyalty was a fragile commodity. They set up a more permanent camp outside a small town near the Trident. Tents dotted the riverbank, and the dragons roost on a low hillside, scanning the horizon. Here, Daenerys and Jon planned to gather any remaining forces loyal to their cause. They awaited further word from Yara, from the Vale, and from any southwestern lords who might have turned from Cersei's rule. Each day, they sent out emissaries, urging local peasants to bring news or supplies in exchange for fair payment. As the camp took shape, Jon found himself confronted by men bearing old grievances, seeking justice or resolution. He did what he could, mindful of the delicate alliances. He noticed Daenerys doing the same. It was a wearying process akin to ruling from the field, and they both felt the strain. Still, it offered a glimpse of what their reign might look like if they emerged victorious. Late one afternoon, as Jon inspected a line of wagons bringing fresh grain from a distant estate, a horn sounded from a lookout. He hurried to the vantage point and saw a column of riders approaching from the west. Banners rippled in the wind, House Tully, House Bracken, House Blackwood, and others. At the head rode a tall figure clad in armor that glinted in the waning sunlight. As they drew closer, Jon recognized the sigil of Riverrun. Could it be Edmure Tully, freed or escaped from captivity? He rushed down to the campsite's entrance, Daenerys joining him. The riders slowed, halting in a swirl of dust and dried grass. Indeed, at the forefront was Edmure Tully himself, looking thinner and more haggard than Jon remembered from the wedding at the Twins so many years ago. Yet a spark of resolve lit the man's eyes. Behind him rode a mix of knights and levies, presumably from the Riverlands. They were about 100 strong, though their gear looked battered. Edmure dismounted awkwardly, leaning on a squire for support. He faced Jon and Daenerys, attempting a respectful bow, though his movements were stiff. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Daenerys first, then turned to Jon, "and your pardon me, I'm unsure of the proper title. I was told you were king in the north, but also allied with the queen." Jon cleared his throat. "We stand together in this fight." He glanced at Daenerys, who nodded. Edmure's gaze swept the camp, taking in the dragons perched on the hillside, the soldiers milling about. "I've traveled far to offer what little assistance I can. The Freys are gone, thanks, I hear, to your sister." He inclined his head at Arya, who hovered near the back of the gathering. She offered no denial, only a silent stare. "Riverrun is ours again, though the land is scarred by war. I was released by Lannister forces who found they had no use for me." A bitter twist curved his lips. "I managed to rally what few knights and bannermen would listen. We heard rumors the Night King was defeated. I wanted to confirm it, to see if there's truly hope." Daenerys stepped forward, voice warm with sympathy. "The Night King is gone. The army of the dead is destroyed. We have only mortal battles left to fight." Edmure nodded, relief and sadness warring in his expression. "My men and I will fight for you against Cersei. We can't forget she allowed the Freys to terrorize the Riverlands. She's no friend to our people, and I have no love for Lannisters. Though I must warn you, my forces are small and the land is weary of war." Daenerys reached out, clasping his hand. "We're grateful for any help you can offer. We hope to gather more allies before confronting Cersei." With your knowledge of the Riverlands, we may be able to navigate more effectively. Edmure exhaled, shoulders slumping a fraction in relief. Then I'll see Riverrun's banners raised alongside yours. Jon offered a tight smile. Welcome. We'll find quarters for your men. Supplies are thin, but we'll share what we have. The new arrivals set up their tents, mingling with the Northern and Targaryen forces. Edmure's presence lent a certain legitimacy to the cause among riverlords who had been on the fence. Ravens flew out again, delivering news of Edmure's alignment with Daenerys and Jon. Slowly, more men trickled in, though nowhere near the numbers Cersei commanded in King's Landing. In quiet moments, Jon couldn't help wondering if it would be enough. Perhaps this was all they could hope for, a modest alliance of the North, the Vale, parts of the Riverlands, the Iron Islands, and 2 dragons. It sounded impressive on paper, but the reality was that each region was exhausted. Daenerys sensed his doubts, but she refused to yield, insisting that the only way to break the cycle of tyranny was to continue forward. One dusk, as the sky turned a deep violet, Daenerys and Jon stood atop a small rise outside the camp, scanning the horizon. Columns of smoke marked distant farmsteads, some ablaze from marauders or the aftereffects of the war. The subtle hum of the Trident's waters drifted on the breeze. Daenerys took a resolute step forward, the tails of her cloak shifting behind her. Tomorrow, we press onward, she said. The scouts say Harrenhal is deserted or nearly so. We'll occupy it briefly to test Cersei's reaction. Jon watched her profile, the set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes. Harrenhal, he mused. That cursed place. Perhaps it can serve us, if only for a time. A faint smile touched her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. I don't believe in curses, Jon. Only the folly of men. He moved closer, the heat of her presence a gentle bulwark against the encroaching night. We'll see this through, he murmured, voice laced with quiet resolve. For everyone who can't fight for themselves. For the families destroyed by the wars. She turned to him then, lifting her chin. We will. Their gazes locked, each silently drawing strength from the other. Behind them, the dragon stirred, letting out low, rumbling calls. Soldiers in the camp below continued to bustle about, preparing for the next day's march. The torches flickered and the night deepened. Overhead, stars blinked into view one by one, indifferent to the struggles of mortals. Jon tilted his head back, letting the stillness fill him for a moment. Tomorrow would bring another march, another step closer to confrontation with Cersei, and another test of their fragile alliance. Daenerys threaded her fingers through his, and they stood thus for a time, side by side, looking out over the quiet land that once trembled under the threat of the dead. The memory of that supernatural darkness lingered, but a sense of purpose guided them now. Together, they had tamed the horrors of the long night, or at least survived them, and here they stood, forging a path through mortal strife. The wind whispered across the plain, carrying the faint echoes of old battles and new possibilities. Despite everything, hope glimmered like a distant star, and they pressed on in search of a dawn that promised a realm united under fire and ice, free at last from the nightmares of the past.